under what we usually call NEP process, the National Environment Action Planning process, which was part of the PEP process, the Poverty Eradication Action Plan for Uganda. You remember? You were not born anyway. Of early 1990s. So NEMA was established as the principal agency for environment management in Uganda with key 4 mandates: to coordinate, to supervise, to monitor, and to regulate all activities of environment in Uganda. Now, NEMA was created with several other lead agencies with which NEMA works. So NEMA is the principal, meaning it is overseeing, but below NEMA there are lead agencies which are in charge of respective segments of environment. Uganda Wildlife Authority in charge of wildlife and wildlife protected areas. Wetland Management Department, Ministry of Water and Environment, in charge of wetlands, together with local governments and urban authorities. National Forestry Authority for Central Forest Reserves. Forestry Sector Support Department, Ministry of Water and Environment, together with district local governments and urban authorities for forests other than Central Forest Reserves. For example, forests on your private land, local government forests, among others. Directorate of Water Resources Management for management of water resources, lakes, rivers. Okay? We also have a Department of Environment Affairs for management of river banks, lake shores, and general environment management in Uganda. So NEMA was created because there are many players in the environment, because the environment is literally everything: human health, social issues, ecological issues, development issues, everything is environment. So that's why NEMA was created, to coordinate all the players and regulate them so that we pursue what we call sustainable development. This concept was born in 1972 during the first UN conference on environment and development, where the world agreed, including Uganda, that in order to pursue development that is not destructive to environment, we need to move the two things together: environment and development. And in order to manage that intersection, you need a referee, you need a go-between, the go-between between environment and development. And that's what we call the regulator. And the regulator is the National Environment Management Authority. So we are the government path to sustainable development. We guide the economy to ensure that we grow. First of all, we must grow as a nation. We must develop as a nation. We must not stagnate. But as we develop sustainably without damaging environment. So that's what NEMA is basically responsible for. We are class monitors, call it class monitors or headmasters for environment management in Uganda. But we work through the lead agencies who are directly in charge of management of respective segments of environment. So when we regulate, we also do enforce. We set standards, we formulate policies and laws, and then we enforce them. We enforce compliance, working together with the lead agencies, especially local governments, urban authorities, and the specific lead agencies that I've mentioned. So for every segment of environment, there is a lead agency. Waste management, for example, is urban authorities and local governments. So is air quality. So ours is to ensure that, are they doing this work? If they are not doing it, what are the issues? How can we help them build the capacity? How can we support them to enforce the law? So in a nutshell, that is NEMA.
Okay. So as a governing body of the environment, to what extent is the environment being degraded in Uganda?
The rate of environment degradation in Uganda, I should say, just as Africa and the world, is high. The world is grappling with 3 things, and Uganda is no exception. High rates of biodiversity loss, high levels of pollution due to industrialization and human activities, and the big elephant in the room, climate change. So the planet Earth, on which Uganda is, on which Africa is, on which the entire world is now, as we know it, is grappling with the crisis of environment degradation. And that's why we are having climate change. Climate change has come because of the polluters in the industrialized countries, Americas, Europe, Russia, India, China, and other industrialized countries who release emissions to the atmosphere, which have caused global warming, and we are all now victims of the consequences of global warming. We are receiving more rainfall than we expect. We are receiving more droughts than expected. We are seeing distorted weather patterns, and this has impacts on biodiversity, and then the cycle continues. So human activities are changing the temperatures. The temperatures are changing now the rainfall patterns and weather patterns. And this has a consequence on the biodiversity or creatures which have life. Because if a snail was meant to live at a certain temperature and the temperature has changed, it's going to be affected. If an elephant was supposed to live in a home range of, say, 30 kilometers squared, but in that home range, food now is no longer there because of weather disruption, then that elephant home range is going to change. When it changes, there will be more conflicts with nature, human-wildlife conflict, you've heard about it. And so the vicious cycle continues. So we must heal the planet. Pollution is on the increase. Plastic pollution itself, globally, it is estimated that the total mass of plastics now in the environment has almost surpassed the natural mass of organic matter which God created. So the created mass is competing with the natural mass. So we are headed for disaster if we do not address this situation. I'm happy that the world is alive to these challenges. There are efforts to combat climate change globally. There are efforts to combat biodiversity loss. There are efforts to combat plastic pollution. And Uganda is a part of these processes. So to answer your question, environment degradation in Uganda, just like it is in Africa and the world, is on, the degradation is on the increase on account of increased industrialization, increased human population, expanding urbanization, and expanding agriculture to feed the high population, and this results in encroachment on sensitive ecosystems, which would help us to cope with climate change. And now that makes us more vulnerable, especially us in Africa, who do not contribute significantly to global emissions, because the whole continent combined does not contribute more than 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Uganda contributes less than 0.1 of greenhouse gas emissions for the world. So we are net victims of the developed world. But we are making the situation worse by degrading our ecosystems. If we degrade the forests, if we degrade the wetlands, our capacity to cope with impacts of global climate change will be less. So our environment helps us to adapt better. So we must protect our ecosystems in order to adapt well. Our ecosystems are also under pressure, significant pressure. For example, in 1900, it is estimated that 45% of Uganda's land surface was covered by forests. 45%. Then this forest decreased up to around 1994 when it dropped significantly to about 15%. This further dropped around the mid 2007, 2006. Our forest cover, no, 2020, around 2016, 2017, 2019, our forest cover dropped to only 9%. Just 9% from 45. So in the last 25 years, we've decreased further from 25 up to only 9%. So in other words, we almost reached an extent of almost running out of forests. That's why we have a campaign now of roots program, running out of trees. This campaign, every Ugandan must plant and raise at least one tree, one seedling in a year. So those are 40 million trees per year, plus private sector and also conservation of public forests by NFA, UA, and other institutions. We are now seeing the curve is turning. So the country's forest cover has now increased from 9% to 10 to 11. We are now talking of 13%. So the curve is turning, but we still have a long way to go. You can imagine 13% when we had 15, 25 years ago. So we want to go back at least to 15 by 2040. And then we continue until at least we recover perhaps 20. If we get back to 20, it would be a good thing. We may not go back at 45. That's not possible because there is no space. The human population in 1900 and the human population in now, you know the figures. So we cannot reverse the tide up to where we were in 1900. Globally, it is worse. The forest loss globally is far, 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 far higher than the forest loss in Uganda. And that's why we are suffering with the global impacts of climate change. So the situation is not very good, but we are doing the best to return it to heal the world. If we go to wetlands, in 1994...
Before you go to the wetlands, which were the most degraded forests?
The biggest loss of forest cover in Uganda has been on private land. People converting their trees or their forested land into agriculture farms. Actually, almost 95% of forests that we have lost has been on private land because of expansion of agriculture. So the lost land acreage in forestry is actually the gained land acreage in agricultural expansion. So the biggest loss has been on private land, and that's why we must focus. There has been a slight encroachment on government forests, but not at the level of private land where forests have been completely finished. We used to have forested areas, non-government, non-gazetted, private forests. These have already been converted into agricultural fields. So that's the biggest problem. The encroachment on public land is there, but manageable. It is manageable. For example, all national parks are intact. Forest reserves are intact, apart from pockets of encroachment here and there. Central forest reserves, the natural ones are intact, but some of them are under pressure. You know, Bugoma, for example, Mabira, they are under pressure, but there are efforts to recover them. Just yesterday, we were restoring Mabira forest as part of celebrations to commemorate International Day for Biodiversity. So it is easier to restore gazetted public forests. It is even more hard to restore agricultural fields. So what we promote now is agroforestry, so that you can use your land, yes, for agriculture, but have mixed farming, have crops, but also have trees. Because these trees, you need them for shade, for animals, for example, in the farms. You need trees for, biomass energy, fuel, and what have you, for construction. So you need trees also for soil stabilization. If you do not have trees in your farm, the rain is going to come and your fields will be washed away, which will destroy our rivers and lakes, but also your soil. You will not have productivity. So we need to exercise to mix crops and trees together so that we can produce food, we can produce cash crops, but we can also have our environment. And it is possible. If you go to Europe, some towns in Europe, or even in Japan, they have more trees per square meter than Africa. Did you know that? No. Cities in Europe have more trees per square meter than cities in Africa. How do they do it? They manage their urban areas in a green way. Road reserves are all planted with trees. All buildings have trees. They have gardens, backyard trees. So we must shift to that. Japan, it is the same thing. Cities have a lot of trees. If you compare, for example, Owino or Central Business District here with Kololo, which one has more trees? Kololo. Thank you very much. So similarly, cities in Europe have more trees than cities in Africa. So what we need is to green our cities. Does Kololo become less beautiful because it has more trees? It actually becomes more beautiful when it has more trees. So development should not be seen to mean concrete buildings. No, beauty is not about glass and concrete, mortar and steel. No, green is beauty. So we need to green our development so that we can have settlements, we can have agriculture, we can have industrialization, but which are green. And we shall soon introduce what we call the net zero growth of the economy. If you have a factory, you must account for all your emissions. The emissions you cannot reduce through manufacturing, you must pay for them, either through establishing your own carbon sinks, your own tree farms, or you pay somebody else in Uganda who is going to manage the trees to absorb your emissions. That way, everyone will be responsible for their emissions. Yeah.
Looking at the population of Uganda, it's very high. And recently the president hinted on something on charcoal burning, abolishing charcoal burning in Gulu and some other parts of the country. Do you think this is achievable?
I think it is achievable because do we have charcoal in Europe? I don't think we have charcoal in Europe.
But here the poverty levels are very high.
Where, when you burn charcoal, actually you increase poverty. How? You are degrading the agricultural land where people are depending for rainfall for agriculture productivity. When the soils lose productivity, the people are going to die of hunger, they are not going to make more money. And the trees you cut for charcoal are not going to grow the next day. So the charcoal dealer will become rich in a very short time. The local people will become more poorer. So charcoal is not increasing poverty reduction, no. It actually increases poverty. It enriches the dealer will get money in a short time, and the people will have to suffer for the rest of their lives. So, what the president is saying and what we have said, we've issued a public circular on commercial charcoal burning, which is going on. Commercial charcoal burning going on in Uganda now is illegal. To do commercial charcoal production, you require an environment and social impact assessment, which will confirm that you have enough trees, you have a plan to replant them, you have a harvesting plan which is sustainable, so that by the time you finish harvesting here, the trees you planted the other side have grown and you are ready to continue producing charcoal. But this business where our dealers leave Kampala and they go to north, east, west, and they just indiscriminately cut everything, that is very dangerous. It enriches the dealer at the expense of the wananchi. The local person becomes more poor. So we need to go into alternatives to charcoal. We can sustain the charcoal at small scale if it is, subsistence charcoal burning that even doesn't require a permit of government. But the problem is commercial level scale charcoal burning without a plan for replanting the areas which are cut down, without a plan for sustainable harvesting and regeneration. So the solution should be, in the short term, we should regulate charcoal burning. We only leave charcoal burning for subsistence use by the local people. And then we put in place alternatives to shift the population. Because the people using this charcoal are not where the charcoal is actually burnt from. Charcoal is coming to Kampala here. So charcoal is coming to cities and towns. Which cities and towns have access to electricity, they have access to gas, but the dealers are getting charcoal coming to profit here at the expense of the wananchi. So,
but looking at Kampala, the standards of living are not the same. Look at the people in the slums. Do you think they can manage using electricity every day for cooking?
We have a lot of waste generated in Kampala and other cities. This waste can be actually put to use to generate what we call briquettes. You've heard about briquettes? So, urban cities are choking with waste. So there is a lot of raw material to actually make charcoal instead of cutting down trees from Karamoja, from Amuru, from Masaka. Not at all. That's very wrong. Let's focus on creating charcoal or briquettes, which is more sustainable charcoal, from the mushrooming waste that we have in cities. So we shall have double benefit. We shall have managed sanitation. We shall have provided cheaper alternative to energy, and we shall have a cleaner environment. So we need to go into briquette making, but even before we go there, we need to reduce the energy we use through energy conservation measures. For example, energy conserving cooking stoves in schools, in barracks, in prisons, in the police, in the military, big establishments that use a lot of energy. Then the factories should also move from using firewood. The factories should use alternative sources of energy like hydropower, like use of waste to generate power. Some factories are already using sawdust and other waste to generate power. That way we shall reduce the demand for trees, for charcoal, and for firewood. But we also have to move to gas. For those who can afford, I'm not saying every Ugandan can afford gas. No, that's not true. So we need to go at levels. Those who can afford electricity, shift to electricity. Those who can afford the gas, shift to gas. Those who cannot afford those luxuries, reduce how much charcoal you are using and how much firewood you are using through improved energy cooking stoves. Those are not expensive, so nobody can say they cannot afford an improved energy cooking stove. They are not very expensive. You will say they're expensive, but the question will be, are you getting charcoal for free? Certainly not. If you misuse charcoal, you're actually spending more money. So instead of buying more charcoal, you can buy an improved energy cooking stove to reduce on your cost for charcoal. But ultimately, we should all transition from charcoal to briquettes, to gas, to electricity, and low-level use of charcoal.
As you have heard it from the horse's mouth, let's live in our environment responsibly to stop it from degrading. In our next episode, Dr. Kyakuwa will be enlightening us on wetlands and our responsibility in preserving them.
Up next on UBC, brought to you by
Airtel. Download Airtel TV to watch and support Ugandan talent on The Voice Africa every Sunday at 8 p.m.